And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Bison Chat. It is Tuesday, November 19th. I'm Galen Clavio, Joe Cronin. Joining me again on the show, we got the delightful Emily Fox in the background, pushing the buttons and making the magic happen as we are here for the next 45 minutes plus to talk IU football. It was a bye week, but that didn't mean that nothing happened. A lot has happened, and we are in the midst of one of the biggest lead-up weeks that we've ever had in IU football. You can feel the excitement building as Indiana gets ready for a top 5 matchup in Columbus, in the shoe, taking on the Ohio State Buckeyes. Joe, I don't know about you, but it's hard for me to get my head wrapped around the enormity of everything that's happening, what happened this past weekend, and what Indiana is facing as they head into Columbus this Saturday.
Yeah, I thought with Cignetti's contract being signed like 9 a.m. on Saturday, it was almost like a middle finger to them being on bye week. It's like, all right, we're still going to make it about ourselves and sign this historic deal, that big contract solidifying him for 8 years. And what a time to do it. I mean, had Big Noon interviewing him, stuff like that, kept the attention. I really liked seeing the video when Cignetti went to, it was the IU Dance Marathon, and he gave them a little speech. And it sounded exactly like I imagined, like, you know, his locker room talk is before a game. It's like 1,000 guys doing our job. I was like, it's the same thing we hear, like 11 guys doing our job. It was just like this guy just bleeds coaching, and you could tell that it's kind of translated into different parts. But it was really cool to see him embrace different parts of Bloomington outside of football. Obviously, with that first bye week, it's still kind of hard. You're 6-0, still figuring out the lay of the land. This one was like, this is one of the biggest fundraisers, not just in college, but in all of the country, a big staple of Bloomington. So to see him embrace that in year one, I thought was very cool. To like the icing on the cake of signing the contract. Like, he's here. Yes, contract is there, but also like he's a part of this culture that Bloomington is about.
No, that's a great point. I think most of the successful football coaches, like the really successful ones, the ones that build a program, they end up becoming very ingrained in the culture of the university. And this is no different. I mean, showing up at Dance Marathon, it's such a huge event. I saw that same video, and it was just really cool. Not the speech itself, but the speech itself was cool. Don't get me wrong. But the fact that he took the time to do it, which, you know, you don't have to, but, you know, especially leading into getting that contract extension. Like, it was just this perfect synergy in terms of everything. We got a lot to talk about on the show. We're going to be talking about the matchup with Ohio State. We're going to do that a little bit later in the show. But I do want to start off with the contract extension. We covered this, Scott and I did, on Crimson Cast on Saturday. I made Scott get out of bed, in Westfield and was yelling at him. I was like, we got to get on. We got to do an emergency show. People want to talk about this. And it was one of those things that I had a good suspicion Indiana was going to sign Curt Cignetti to an extension. I didn't think that he was really going to go anywhere else. I'd heard some inside material that led me to believe that. But still, the financial terms of the deal aren't just great for Curt Cignetti and not just great for Indiana football in the short term. But from my perspective, from a historical perspective, what it represents is an unprecedented investment in the football program that Indiana has decided to make. We talked about this when Tom Allen got his contract extension after the 2020 season. You know, his pay gets bumped up to where he was making like close to $5 million a year. And that was the most by far that Indiana had ever paid a coach. They paid some of his assistants more than they'd ever paid assistants before. Curt Cignetti getting an $8 million a year contract with an extra guaranteed $1 million a year as a retention bonus. You know, that $9 million a year figure, that puts him in close to the top 10 in football coaches across the country. And Joe, like, it's not just that, it's also an increase in the assistant pool. We don't know how much. It's also a promise to continue to upgrade the facilities. It's also a promise we're going to continue to do NIL. We're going to continue to increase that. I just keep coming back to how much has changed with IU football from where we were last year at this time. Everybody's despondent. A lot of people think Tom Allen's going to still be here for another year because his buyout was so big. It's amazing to think of everything that's happened in the last 365 days when it comes to IU athletics and IU football specifically.
Yeah, the fact that it's been like less than a year for that too, from Allen being fired, the buyout, to what has happened, this 10-0 start, the historic contract for Cignetti. It shows, I guess, maybe the vision that Scott Dolson had when he first took this athletic director job, and sometimes it takes road bumps or speed blocks to get to that point. And it seems like those things, the pieces are starting to align more. And yes, the ambition of year one of the 63-year-old head coach to hand him a big old $8 million contract with the $1 million each year bonus, that's ambitious, especially he's played 10 games of sample size. But now there's an expectation, and I think there is a strong confidence that, trickles from head coach to athletic director to president. I think they all believe that this isn't some fluke. This is something that is real. Yes, he brought in a lot of his guys, but you have to imagine, regardless of what happens the rest of the season, Indiana is going to be one of the hot markets for any transfer around the country, especially at the Power 5 level. I mean, if he's shown anything, it's that he can make these guys that may have, or at the Group of 5 level, he could. These guys that maybe have not had the chance at the top level, and he's proven to make them high caliber potential draft picks, put them on the spotlight. So I think it's good overall for the football scene to lock him in. Obviously, there's some outside chatter for the Twitter world saying, Florida, but then Napier was guaranteed to stay at least another year. Florida State, but who knows what's going on there, going back to his home, West Virginia, stuff like that. But when it was all said and done, I just noticed his demeanor and his investment, even before going to a dance marathon. It was like the UCLA game when he just embraced all the fans there. It's like, this seems real. Like he's noticing the effort that the outside perspective is putting into him being there. So I think good all around for all parties.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think ultimately, and let's just hear from Cignetti himself. Like, he talked about the extension and why he wanted to re-sign with Indiana. We've got some sound on that.
Some people say, well, why would you do that when, this one may open, that one may open, and you're going to be a hot commodity and blah, blah, blah. And the fact of the matter is, we're the emerging superpower in college football. Why would I leave? I'm excited about our future. We've done a lot of good things. We've got a lot of people behind us. And this is where I wanted to be. I played the what-if game with my wife and my agent 4 weeks ago. And it all pointed to where I'm at right now.
I mean, first of all, it's really gratifying that a guy who's clearly got this guy's level of ability as a head coach gets hired at a place and feels the love, it feels the support, and feels strongly enough about sticking around, and his wife feels the same way. As much as we've heard for years and years, like no one wants to coach football at IU or nobody wants to live in Bloomington, that does not seem to be the case in either of these circumstances, and that's really exciting. But I loved the emerging superpower in college football quote, because it bothered so many people. Like, I saw so many comments on social media who were like, all right, this is no longer funny. And there's two things about it. A, it's hilarious because you could take it as if he was saying it seriously, or you could also take it tongue in cheek, which I think it clearly was tongue in cheek to some degree. But that kind of statement, especially the way he delivers it, it instills a level of confidence and a feeling of self-worth in a fan base that just simply has never had either of those things.
I mean,
and with students especially, Joe, last thing I'll say, that fires students up when they hear that. And when they talk about that to other people at other schools, it might seem like boastfulness, but it's really bravado, and bravado is what sells in sports.
I mean, I will say on the student side, there is a lot of out-of-state kids that go to Indiana, and especially freshmen, that this is their first ever view of IU football. So their first ever vision of IU football is a 10-0 season with this uber confident head coach. But I will say, this is a guy that's been calling his shot since the moment he got to campus. I mean, go back to Big Ten media days where he's making a comment. He's like, we're picked to finish 17th. That's happened 2 other times. We've come out on top of the conference when that happens. This is time number 3, and look where they are right now. I mean, they're guaranteed a top 4 finish in an 18-team conference, the arguable 1 or 2 conference in the entire landscape of college football. So they've done the dirty work so far, and he has called his shot from the get-go, and I think that's just so impressive. There's so much confidence, and I mean, that's where it starts. If you don't believe, you can't make it happen. And he believes and is making it happen.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. Like, so much of this ends up getting wrapped up in this idea of what are you doing? Like, what's your program stand for, and why should people care? And it's always been so hard to answer that question for Indiana. And Cignetti has no problem highlighting exactly what the program stands for and why people should care. And he wants people out there. And the connection that's growing between him and the fan base already. We've seen it at road games. We see it in these interviews. It's what makes this whole thing so special. And, it's not just that they signed a coach to an extension. And you mentioned about like the group of 5 coaches, and like maybe this gives some of them some shots that they might not have had otherwise. The thing with Cignetti, I think it's going to be fascinating to watch is how many people are going to revisit their hiring practice and say, how did we miss this guy? Like, how is this guy sitting there for years? And of all the Power 5 programs, only Indiana thought, you know what, let's hand this guy the keys and see what he does. I'm really fascinated to see how that process goes.
I also think with that point, he might ruin, in a sense, the hiring process, because now these other teams are going to have this expectations that they can go from 3-9 to 10-0. That's not how it works usually.
Yeah.
95% of the time, maybe even more. This is a rare occurrence in sports, not just college football, but in sports in general, that much of a turnaround. I understand the amount of player turnover, but their ability to just jump into, like, from Sun Belt to Big Ten has been incredible up to this point. I mean, just like a hypothetical, if Mike Norvell over at Florida State gets fired for this awesome season that Florida State's having right now, and they go out and grab, I'm not sure, maybe Boise State's coach is on the market, something like that. Is their expectation right away to have this kind of immediate success? I'm not sure what the landscape of this new head coach hiring process will be. And I think it'll be interesting. And I think in the future, we're going to see more coaches fired within 2 years. And you're going to start to see kind of like how the NBA works, like where the job security is just going to get worse. And that's how it starts right there. I mean, you set a tone, and obviously I'm making a very bold prediction right there.
That's fine. That's what we expect from you, Jared. That's why you're on the show. You're the wild card, all right? I'm the boring conservative guy here. No, I'm kidding. Let's switch gears a little bit. It was the bye week, and that was welcome, not just for Indiana, but for a lot of other programs, and really comes at an opportune time, I think, for Indiana, given their next opponent. Let's hear what Coach Cignetti had to say on that front.
In terms of the bye week, I think across college football, everybody's hurting a little bit at this point, right? Even when you're playing every play in the game, you've got something. The off week came at a great time because it was a physical football game. We've played a number of games in a row, and it was good for everybody to catch a breather and get refreshed and recharged, and gave us a little extra time on the next opponent.
And you need the time on the next opponent when the next opponent is Ohio State and they're ranked, second in the country, and you haven't beaten Ohio State since 1988. I mean, there's so much about this game that needs attention. And some of it, I think, Joe, comes to, you look at the Michigan game. Indiana wins that game, gets to 10-0, but they lose Miles Price to an injury. It sounds like he's going to be back.
Yeah,
but they kind of lost their offense in the second half of that game. Like, Michigan figured some things out, made it really hard for Indiana to move the ball. They did when they absolutely had to at the end of the game. But you've seen that game, the Washington game, like a couple of games now in a row against physical competition, which Ohio State certainly is, where Indiana started to struggle in the offensive phase. And so, to me, this coaching staff is so smart, both sides, Mike Shanahan and Tino Sunseri on the offensive side, Brian Haynes and his staff on the defensive side. They're going to get 2 weeks to go back, look at what's working, look at what's been sussed out on film, look at what Ohio State's doing and what's worked against them. And they're going to be able to game plan for this entire time. Whereas Ohio State, like, they had to play Northwestern this last week, and they've got Michigan next week. They're kind of stuck in this spot where they have to pay attention to Indiana, but they don't get to pay as much attention as Indiana's getting to pay to them.
I do think they are catching a slight break that Michigan's having the season they're having. If Michigan was, in the 8-9 win category, this could be a dangerous scenario for Ohio State because of the way they've played against Michigan these past couple seasons, and just knowing that I mean, the entire fan base of Ohio State would be calling for Ryan's day job to be torched if they lost to Michigan again, which would be interesting, especially this year. But I will say, again, we talked about it last week. The bye week just came at a perfect time. Like you said, Miles Price goes down. It just seems like a lot of physical games in the row. Curtis Rourke misses that Washington game. He's, a few weeks removed from surgery, gets another week and 2 full weeks to kind of get back, get that throwing motion more intact, get a feel for how everything's feeling with his thumb, because that's the most important appendage when you're throwing a football is the thumb. And I do think it came at the perfect time.
The arm in general is pretty important. I don't know if I would just want to.
The arm isn't, but like I'm saying, of the fingers, the thumb is probably the most important. But like some people don't call thumb a finger, so I just said appendage.
Fair enough.
I'm no doctor. I don't know. I'm in sports media. I'm not in the med school.
Well, all good. I appreciate your thought process on that. But no, all of that is right. And I think also for Indiana, one of the things that's really going to be fascinating and maybe the thing that ultimately decides the game is, can you slow Ohio State's offense down? And, as good as the defensive line especially has played recently, the way that they disrupted Michigan, Michigan had the worst running game they've had all year against Indiana, and that's saying something because they're a really good running team. As much as these members of the secondary have really started to kind of increase in their quality of play, the defense is really going to be zeroing in on what Ohio State tries to do. And it's a tough assignment because Ohio State's a really athletic and good team. But what's really exciting is that they're going to have all of this time to work through it. And I am, for one, very fascinated to see how all of this plays out as we go into this bye week or come out of the bye week and go into the game.
Yeah, I was taking deep dives into watching Ohio State film, looking at their stats side by side, Indiana stats. They're very similar.
They're very similar.
IU has the nod and some like very glaring, like the points, the red zone touchdowns. That is like unreal. Like IU is first by a lot in their red zone performance, red zone touchdowns this season. Dr. Joe Cronin, I guess that's my new label. I don't have my doctorate quite yet. That's a long time in the works. maybe one day.
You're like Doogie Howser, but the sports media version. So
yeah, I'm not sure.
A little old for you, but anyway, go on.
One thing about Ohio State that could be a concern with Indiana is something I noticed in the IU Michigan game is there were some balls that were open in the middle of the field, kind of that second level, looking for the tight end, and Davis Warren just missed him. Overthrew him, way to the side. And I do think Will Howard he's one of the better quarterbacks in the conference. I'd say top 5, top 4, whether or not with Drew Aller, wherever your rankings are, I'm not really sure. But accuracy-wise, he's above 70%. He's thrown over 20 touchdowns. He's top 4 in yards and also has 2 of the best receivers in the entire conference, yet alone the country. Right. There's your area of concern right there because defensive line, I do think IU will be able to get in their backfield and limit their rushing attack, which is crazy to think because they have Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson. But I just think, James Carpenter and Michael Kamara have just been feasting all season long. They feasted against a very good Michigan offensive line, and that Ohio State offensive line is similar, right around the same tier. I think that will be fine. It's really that second level secondary, the linebacker, the pass defense that could be some areas of concern. Definitely going to have eyes out for that. We'll see if the pass rush can force Howard into some, sacks, throwaways, stuff like that. But that's the first thing that I noticed when seeing the Ohio State offense thriving.
Indiana's offense has, had some really good experiences, obviously, but has had some fits and starts over the course of the last few games. I'm really fascinated to see what does Indiana lean on? Now, there's one big thing that has not been talked about yet in relation to this game, and I think it's worth bringing up right now. Now, these things can change, as we know, but I just want to note the weather forecast right now for Columbus.
It's cold.
Right now, 47, but with a wind chill of 39. West-northwest winds of 14 miles an hour with gusts to 27. A 60% chance of precipitation, not a huge amount of precipitation, but it's going to be cloudy. It's going to be ugly. There's kind of competing arguments on this. We had Dane Sansenbacher on the podcast earlier today, and one of the things that he talked about was he felt that was an advantage for Indiana because it kind of levels the playing field. It takes away some of the home field advantage. It'll take the crowd out of it a little bit if it's that nasty. Taylor Lehman, in our preview later on this week, has really felt like Indiana might have a chance to test this passing defense for Ohio State, given you've got 5 functional, not just functional, but really good receivers and a quarterback in Curtis Rourke that can get the ball to them. So I don't know what that forecast means. We have seen Indiana play in these conditions kind of so far this year. It was warmer, but Maryland was not nice conditions, versus Ohio State really hasn't played in conditions like this at all so far this year. So interesting twist in terms of what exactly you might expect from this game and how that might affect what you were expecting.
Well, the first thing I did notice is how at least you've given me an alert of how I need to dress for being on the sidelines.
That was the reason I did it. You would show up in like shorts or something.
No. I've not shown up in shorts. Not shown up in shorts all year. But I did. It was last year. It was at Michigan. It was their fall break. It was 52-7, something like that. It was like 40 and rainy, and I had a short sleeve shirt on and like pants, and I was like, this is horrible. What have I done to myself? Anyways, regardless of that, with the weather,
with Joe,
it kind of goes into what I just said with Ohio State's passing game. That kind of takes it away a little bit, and I think IU will be able to run the ball well enough because, again, Justice Ellison and Tyson Lawton are great running backs, and that offensive line for IU has just been so good. And with the noise, I'm going to counter that. The noise is going to be there. Ryan Day talked in his press conference today, and he was like, this is the chance to show the country that these are, what he said, the best damn fans in all the land. They're going to fill 110,000, and this is an IU team that has not seen a stadium like that outside of a select few guys, but all those guys are on the offensive line. That's why I think the offensive line will be fine.
You're probably right on that. But the interesting thing about that's the second time that I know of this week that Ryan Day has had to say something to the fans about being loud. And it's interesting to think about because this happens at Michigan a lot. It actually doesn't get that loud there because the fans are just kind of expecting wins. And they only get really fired up against opponents that they feel like they need to get fired up against. Ohio State, they got Michigan next week. You need no cause to get fired up for that. You got Penn State normally comes in. You can get fired up for that. Indiana's hard to get fired up for if you're fans. And it's a noon game. There's a lot of these things where you're just kind of like, well, it might not be as compelling of an environment. It'll still be nuts with 110,000 people in there, but there's levels to these things. And it does make me wonder, like, can Indiana get out to a fast start against Ohio State? Can they try to take the crowd out of it a little bit or at least make them nervous? Because if they can, you add in the weather conditions, you add in the fact it's a noon kick, like that starts to have some impacts.
Absolutely. And something with the crowd is always like the pre-snap penalties, getting the snap off. And I want to go back to it. IU center Mike Kadick, he has been at IU for 6 years. He has played at Penn State. He has played at Ohio State. He's played at Michigan. If there's anyone that will be comfortable snapping the ball, like that is about the perfect option you can have. And I think like that might negate some of the pre-snap problems that you might expect a team that hasn't gone into an environment like this. But I will say, I think Ohio State understands what's on the line. I think their fan base understands what's on the line because if they lose, they are not in the Big Ten championship. And they are now fringe. Now they are traveling for a playoff game. Like they're at the end side of the playoffs. So they know what's on the line for this. And I mean, I think Ryan Day understands like another loss in the regular season, although like he's had a terrific regular season record. He has 9 losses in his 6 years. That's fantastic. Just with the weight of that job, his job security now just goes way down the drain if he loses to Indiana. So I think there is a lot on the line with this team. They spent $20 million on this roster. So I think the fans will show up for that.
We've got the college football playoff reveal going on right now. I'm going to fill in the rankings that we've seen so far. We got Illinois at 25th, which is a surprise. I'm baffled at the love for Illinois. I look at their stats.
What? They want to get one more Big Ten team in there. They're tied out
with that.
Four top five teams.
UNLV at 24, Mizzou at 23. Another one I don't really get.
Missouri should not be ranked. Oh my God.
Iowa State 22, Arizona State 21, Tulane 20. And then we got Army at 19. That's a really interesting one for a couple of reasons. South Carolina at 18. Clemson at 17, and then Colorado comes in at 16. So not a lot that is, I guess, shocking in that, other than I still don't understand the infatuation with Missouri. But this is kind of holding serve based upon what we thought we were going to see with all of this. Perhaps a little bit of a surprise that the two teams in the American, Army and Tulane, are that close together. And that could have some implications down the line, which we'll talk about here shortly. Texas A&M at 15th, which is exactly where they were in the last rankings. And again, that's going to be an interesting one because they get to play Texas later. BYU drops 8 spots. So BYU now 14th in the rankings. And I believe they are still at this point, they're the highest rated and projected Big 12 champ. But that would mean, if I'm doing my math properly, that they would not have a bye. They would be the 5th conference champion. Because what they've done here is they put Boise State ahead of BYU, which means Boise State will get the 4th seed, and there is no 5th seed. There's no fifth bye, is what I'm saying. So that would mean BYU, if they are indeed the highest ranked Big 12 team, would be 12th in the bracket. SMU moves ahead of BYU in this, even though, interestingly enough, BYU beat SMU earlier in the season, as Sam Newcomb just pointed out in the chat. But no, SMU at 13th, and they continue to slowly creep up the rankings. That's good news for the ACC, Joe. Joe might be frozen, so we're going to wait to see. No, he's back. There he is.
It just unfroze. I'm not going to lie. I kind of missed the question.
That's fine. We're going to move forward. Boise State is 12th in this. And so that means that if I'm doing my math correct, I don't think the 11th ranked team is in the playoff right now. This is interesting.
Wow.
So Boise State moves up 1. They're in 12th. Let's see what the 11th spot ends up being revealed as here. We're just taking a dramatic pause for everybody, and it's Tennessee. So Tennessee drops 4 spots after that loss to Georgia. So now they are 11th in the rankings at 8-2. We're going to move into the top 10. Georgia only moves up 2 spots. A lot of people thought Georgia was going to move up a lot more than this, but Georgia ends up being 10th in the rankings. They only climb up 2 spots. I would argue that's very good news for Indiana for reasons we can talk about later. Ole Miss also moves up 2 spots. And I guess they're trying to keep the logical consistency of the fact that Ole Miss beat Georgia and therefore should be ahead of Georgia, which means we all need to be rooting for Florida to knock off Ole Miss. I think that's the logical conclusion of that line of thought. Number 8 is Miami, who moves up a spot. All right. So this is trending in a positive direction because, again, and I think we keep losing Joe. He's having some internet issues. But this is interesting because Miami, as a one-loss team without any real good wins, is still 8th ahead of those 2 SEC teams. And I think that's a really important point. Alabama up 3 spots to 7th. So they have decided that Alabama's resume with the win over Georgia is more impressive than Ole Miss's win over Georgia because of the rest of Alabama's schedule, probably because they beat LSU. Notre Dame up 2 spots. They go to 6th. This means Indiana is top 5 in this. This is pretty wild. There they are. Indiana, they're 5th. They stick around in the top 5. And Emily, you want to hop on since Joe's not on anymore? No, we got a big no from Emily on that one. I don't know. I can't hear. I'm certain that Greg McElroy is saying something stupid about Indiana or Joey Galloway. Someone will have to fill me in later on this. But Indiana does not jump Penn State, so Penn State's going to stick around, and they're going to still be, I'm assuming, in 4th place in this ranking. I got to tell you, folks, I really think the fact Indiana's 5th with this record, with the current strength of schedule, which is actually going to get better regardless of what happens in that Ohio State game, this is really good news for Indiana, the fact that they are still 5th in the rankings. And I think okay, good. We got Joe back. Trent saying what I was not surprised to hear. They said IU just has to keep it close against Ohio State to stay in. I don't know if they need to keep it close. I mean, because again, if like it would be helpful to keep it close, but I mean, what is close? Define close to me. Is close like 2 touchdowns? If that's the case, yeah, I think that's certainly doable. And then Texas third, Ohio State second, and Oregon first. If I'm doing my math right here, I think this means Indiana is once again the 7 seed. Because of this screwy bracketing process they've got where they're putting teams in. So as we look at the way that they're going to bracket this rounding here, and I'm sorry for those of you who aren't watching, who are listening to the broadcast after the fact, you're going to have Oregon as your number 1 seed, Texas is your 2 seed, Miami is your 3 seed, and Boise State is your 4, and then BYU, who's 14th, would be the 12. And there's a comment in the chat about Indiana playing BYU. That's not the way that these will actually work, and here's why. Because the top seeded remaining team in this mix is actually Ohio State. So Ohio State would be the 5, Penn State would be the 6, Indiana would be the 7. As the 7, Indiana would match up against Texas in the second round were they to win that game. And I believe that this also, well, let's just watch the bracket. Eventually, they're going to pop all of them in. There we are. So, Indiana as the 7, Notre Dame as the 8, even though they're the 6th overall seed because of the power rankings, which means, again, we'd have a matchup where Indiana would be playing Alabama in the first round in Memorial Stadium in Bloomington. No, I'm sorry. I was wrong. Alabama would play Notre Dame. Indiana would play Ole Miss. Penn State would play Georgia. And Ohio State would play BYU. So we've traded out Kalen DeBoer for a rematch with Lane Kiffin from the Outback Bowl. Joe, what are your thoughts on the reveal as it sits right now?
You know, I didn't expect much motion from the top 5, considering they didn't lose or they didn't play. Obviously, with the SEC doing SEC things this year, there's going to be a lot of shakeup. I mean, Ole Miss they're such an interesting team. I think their ceiling is very high. Their ceiling is a team that can make a run, but their floor has also been some 2 not great losses. I will say they do have the best defensive line in the country. Mm-hmm. They have like 46 sacks in 10 games, which is ridiculous. They're just living in opponents' backfields, if they come to Bloomington, that would be number 1 area right there. And then obviously you can look at some of the offensive guys like Jackson Dart's a good quarterback, a proven quarterback's been there for a while. But I think solid rankings. I do like, punishing teams for losing, like BYU, not giving them that automatic bye. And I think the Big 12 is going to be really interesting because I think Colorado honestly could be the team that comes out of the Big 12. I think they're more talented than BYU, which would, that's given Boise State a little bye week. That's fun. Ashton Genty with some rest. Yeah, that's a dangerous sight. I mean, sure, the team that's going to play Boise State's going to be like, oh my, it's Boise State. But I mean, Ashton Genty is one of the best players in all of college football. I'd be scared after giving that guy some rest.
Well, looking at these overall rankings and some of the things to think about, I'm going to keep going back to what I've said before, which is that the committee is clearly preferring different things. Okay, we're talking about Indiana again on the broadcast. Indiana needs a special episode done on them at this point.
I think they do. Same with Monday Night Football.
I need to hear a little bit more about what's going on with this conversation. So maybe the chat can help with that a little bit. So Booger apparently said if IU doesn't play well against Ohio State, they aren't guaranteed a playoff spot. Okay, fair enough. This is one of those things where I think you can look at, how do we measure what other teams have done and where are we willing or not willing to punish those other teams? If Indiana loses by 14 to Ohio State, they wouldn't cover. But I'll note, Tennessee lost by 14 points to Georgia this past weekend. They're still in the hunt. Clearly, they're not in the playoff right now. But, I think there's no question Indiana needs to show that they can compete against Ohio State. What that ultimately means from a final numbers perspective is really going to be interesting to see how that susses out. But I will say, I think the committee is giving Indiana and its resume a lot more credence than the national conversation has been around Indiana. And that's refreshing because you look at this again. It's like you've got your 4 SEC teams. You've got as they do a resume comparison with these 3. And again, I'm glad they're at least putting strength of record in as the top stat and not strength of schedule, because it does highlight some things, but also highlights like Texas's best 2 wins are Vanderbilt and Arkansas, and Indiana's
big time wins.
Yeah. But I do think from Indiana's perspective, if you look at this, you say, all right, even with everything that's happened up to this point, they've got, Alabama, Georgia, Ole Miss, Tennessee, in that order. All those teams have 2 losses, and at least one of them is guaranteed to have an additional loss, because chances are, Alabama, Georgia is probably going to be the SEC title game, or Texas, could be in there. I guess that'd be the more likely scenario, Texas versus one of those. But that means that you're going to have another team probably drop out of the running because they're going to have 3 losses. There's just a lot of things that are adding up well for Indiana as far as I'm concerned, because it's showing, as you see with how they've got Miami ranked 8th, a loss, as long as you're not going to get blown out, I don't think is going to kill Indiana in this mix. They have done enough based upon what the committee is preferring thus far in all of this.
I do want to point out, apparently Joey Galloway, I'm going to pull up this comment, said that Curtis Rourke should not play.
What?
I'm getting buzzed, and clearly one of the viewers saw that. I don't even know how to process that.
I mean, I'm ready for Tyler Cherry to take over college football. I'm just not sure it should happen right now.
I think what he's saying is, like, don't risk him. Like, a loss is in, but I think that mentality is incredibly weak.
I mean, I don't understand how 1 week you can say IU doesn't deserve to be ranked like this. They haven't played.
It's like, don't play your starting quarterback.
Don't play your starters. That's just
the moment they play their top competition, which that is wow. I will say,
yes, go on.
I was having a conversation with my roommate Zach, and it was like, I could imagine like 2-3 years down the road, if they kind of keep the same format, that there's going to get a point like the final week of the season is almost treated like the final week of the NFL season, where it's like, if the team is in comfortably and can just take their loss, they're going to rest their guys.
This is where
maybe even miss out of a championship to avoid another loss, like something like it's interesting.
This is kind of where they may want to do what they wanted to do during the COVID year, but couldn't because of COVID, which was they were going to have the regular schedule, and then the final week of the season, you were going to have the Big Ten title game, but everybody else was going to match up against like an opponent that was essentially in the same echelon as they were. So everybody had to play. And I think especially in a 12-team playoff era where the SEC and the Big Ten are probably going to be having 3 or 4 teams minimum in every year, there's going to have to be some kind of a change in terms of how we do all of this, because right now, if you make it to the title game and you lose, you're putting yourself in peril. I mean, right now, like Alabama has got to be looking at it and say, well, if we go to the SEC title game and we lose to Texas, or if Georgia goes to the SEC title game and loses to Texas, it's like, well, now you got 3 losses. That should be disqualifying. I mean, whatever you want to say about how good those teams are, 3 losses should be disqualifying based upon the entire history of how college football has chosen to govern itself over the history of time.
I will say the only time that it wasn't that was 2022, but that was it was TCU. They were undefeated the regular season, lost to Kansas State in the Big 12 championship, and still got in at that 4th spot. And I think the argument, I think USC, all they really needed to do was win the Pac-12 championship against Utah, but Cam Rising in his 7th year at the time, I know it's his 7th year now, but I'm making a joke about his age, beat USC. But that was the argument. It was like, they earned that spot to that championship game. So should the loss really be something that is punishing them for making it to the top of the top? Yeah. That's where it walks this fine line. Like, how much more weight is a loss in the championship game as compared to the regular season?
I mean, so good friend of the pod and IU Sports Media alum Stu Jackson just texted me and said, this arguing on the CFP ranking show is ridiculous. Also heard from Matt Blaska, everyone is cherry picking. And that doesn't surprise me. This is the big issue I have. It's like, I know that, these guys are hired to debate, but it's not that hard to take a holistic look at these things rather than just trying to be absolute on one team, because most of the arguments you make against Indiana, you could also make against Notre Dame, yet nobody's making them. Like, people want to criticize Indiana for having a strength of schedule like 100th or 106th. Notre Dame's strength of schedule is 86th. It's not like they've played a murderer's row of teams so far this season. Here's Heather Dinich on air. I can only imagine what she's saying about Indiana. But it'll be interesting as we see all this play out over this next week or two. We got some other comments coming in from Trent. They're also knocking Texas for their best win being Vanderbilt, and Notre Dame for their NIU loss. Chris Fowler is undaunted. Good no. Heather, shockingly, Heather is apparently daunted. I had no idea. Yeah, look, the thing is, ultimately, and for those of you who have been engaging in the discourse on social media here over the last week and a half, it's only going to get worse. And it's fascinating, Joe, and I've had this conversation with several people. I was not expecting IU to break college football or break the SEC, and that seems to be exactly what they've done. I don't know that the Florida State arguments last year were kind of vicious. It was nowhere close to what happens when IU decides to crash the party. And it's really, really wild that all of this is coalescing the way that it is.
So I will say this from someone who I've been very, eyes glued to college football ever since really the playoffs started, because that's kind of when, the frontal lobe's starting to develop a little more. Fell in love with the game then. I have noticed when things are out of the ordinary, I have noticed when things are out of the ordinary in college football, people get pissed. Look at when Alabama and Georgia and Alabama and Clemson were winning their titles. No one's really batting an eye, just letting it happen. Michigan wins, everyone's pissed off. Obviously, they did do some sign stealing, stuff like that. Regardless, but I want to go back to 2021, 2022. Cincinnati makes the college football playoff, and everyone is bent out of shape that an undefeated team made the college football playoff. That competition was there. Yes, they lose big to Alabama, but how are you going to know without giving these teams these shots? That's what it all comes down to. And then the next year with TCU, they beat Michigan in the semifinals, and they get boat raced in a not good game against Georgia, and one of the toughest watch of any national championship I've ever seen, or any final I've ever seen. But still, how are you not going to give them that shot when they had earned it and had even made it to the next level? It's become the norm within this sport that when something is different, when something is changing, people are going to get mad when it's not the same teams every time. Those big fan bases get mad that someone else is stealing the attention away from Alabama or Georgia.
It's an interesting thing, because I was talking about this to some folks today, and really one of the things to understand about college football culture is that it hates new money. And what I mean by that is this: it hates when people who they don't perceive as supposed to be there crash the party. It's really not like that in college basketball. Yes, you've got your blue bloods, but it's such a variable sport.
That's what the NCAA tournament is about. Everyone's always like, "Oh my gosh, the variety of things happening." That's their big thing.
Yeah, but there's a real resistance, and there's your core brands, and we all know the core brands: Alabama, Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State, USC. Texas is in that mix. Oklahoma. You've got the brands that it's like, well, if they're in the party for a little bit, we don't care too much. Clemson, I think, falls into that category. Michigan State falls into that category. LSU is always kind of like halfway in and halfway out the door. Tennessee's kind of the same way. But anybody that comes from outside that, TCU is a great example of that. There's a few others that have popped into the mix, and it's just like there's a real resistance and a real soreness about it. Like, well, they don't belong, or they're not good enough, or, well, we would beat them if we played them. It's always this very negative response. And I just think it's a fascinating and very different kind of culture from what most people in Indiana are used to, because let's be honest, we don't know anything about college football in terms of the larger culture. There's a few people that do in the fan base, but that's not what IU has been weaned on historically. And so I think it's something to keep in mind. The arguments are only going to get worse regardless of what happens. And honestly, if Indiana beats Ohio State, what's going to happen? It's going to shut up the arguments about Indiana, and immediately all the attention is going to get paid to Ohio State. Well, they don't belong. They're not. They clearly aren't that good. They just lost at home to Indiana. The arguments are never going to change. So stop expecting people to embrace logic or embrace the idea that you belong. It's kind of like it's like an 80s high school movie where everybody picks on the one kid who's desperately trying to gain social acceptance, and he never actually gains social acceptance. But by the end of the movie, he's like, I don't need you people. I'm fine by myself. At least, that's how the plot line should work. That's how Indiana and its fans, I think, have to approach it. Don't expect people to welcome you. Expect them to spit in your face and talk about you behind your back, and that's totally fine. What you do is you then go in and do the same with them. That's how this stuff is supposed to work. We had a question from Patrick. Do we really think Sankey, the SEC commissioner, is out pushing an SEC narrative, or are we just paranoid?
I don't think so.
You don't think which one?
I think that they have four of the top 5 teams are Big Ten. I think that speaks volume right there.
Oh, no.
I think that speaks enough.
Hold on. Time out. Not with the committee rankings, but with the discourse, with the media discourse that's been coming in. And I do think there's something to be said. The reaction's gotten more and more negative as Indiana has moved up. They moved up a couple of weeks ago, and they've stayed there now. The reaction to that has engendered this assault on Indiana, which was, if you'll remember, Joe, 3 weeks ago, Indiana was the feel-good story of college football. Everybody was talking about how cool it was that Indiana was 8-0 and was on game day. And then the moment the calendar turns, the idea that all of these people at once, independently, were like, who doesn't belong? Indiana. It just seems a little bit of a stretch. And especially when you consider many of these narratives are coming from ESPN, a company, I'll note, that's in an official business partnership with the SEC and not the Big Ten. There's just a lot of interesting little pieces that you think you may have to consider with all of this.
That's fair. I don't know. I've always been the committee, and I think the playoffs is cool. I think it's good for college football. It's just the way they do it, the way they talk about it. There's 134 teams. It's hard in the grand scheme of things to narrow it down, and especially when they play vastly different schedules. And, when it comes down to it, these 12 teams will have very few common opponents because they're all from different conferences and stuff like that. So it's hard to gauge whether is an undefeated Oregon team better than a 1-loss Texas team when Texas lost to Georgia. What is the difference right there outside of their records? So it just is a bunch of yapping, in my opinion. I just think it's too much talk. Let the teams go out and play. The team that plays better will win. That's what Curt Cignetti said on Monday. The teams that plays better will win. That's how he feels about this Saturday, and that's how these teams probably feel. That's a good thing about the teams. It seems like they're able to block out the noise pretty well, especially these top level teams. It's don't worry about like Georgia. Kirby Smart, there's no way he's going in saying, all right, guys, we're ranked here. We need to win this. No, he's locked in next week, next game. That's just what it is. I don't know. College football has so much money, so much media presence that sometimes it's hard to block out that noise, but the best of the best will be able to do it, push aside whatever SEC bias there is. I don't know. Does the SEC even realize that there's bias? Probably not, because it's favoring them.
Anyway, I think it's a really Ward Manuel had this comment. Of course, we look at strength of schedule, but we also look at how teams are playing. Good, Ward. I'm happy to hear it. Well, let's hope Indiana continues to play well, if that's going to be one of the things that they're looking at. Anyway, we are going to go ahead and wrap up the Bison Chat for the night. We got the rankings out. We got a chance to see what's going on. Still really good news for Indiana, and I think it'll likely stay that way. Joe, any final thoughts from you before we wrap up today?
Well, Saturday is game of the year for these two teams because Ohio State has really their rest of the season on the line. Indiana is trying to prove that they belong in this top 5. That's how you do it right there. You compete. You come away with a win maybe in Columbus. That's how you do it. It is one of 2 ranked games this weekend. The other one is Army and Notre Dame at 7:30. The entire nation is going to be watching this because I don't think they're going to be watching Florida and Ole Miss, respectfully. I really don't think that's going to be happening. The entire country is going to be watching. I think it's going to shatter any sort of viewing records for the weekend. So it's going to be fun. Columbus is going to be rowdy. Maybe some gross Big Ten win. I'm not a bettor, but that over-under is looking very healthy to the under, considering the weather, considering these two teams. It's going to be low-scoring, physical. It's going to be fun. I'm excited.
It's going to be amazing. I'm looking forward to it. We're going to have a lot more podcasts coming up later this week. If you haven't listened to the interview with Dane Sanzenbacher from earlier on today, that's on the feed. It's on the YouTube channel. Go check that out. We've got a special guest who's got IU ties, but has a unique perspective on this matchup that's going to be joining us on Thursday morning. So be sure to tune in for that. We've still got our preview podcast with Taylor Lehman coming up later on this week. We've got Crimson Cash coming up later on this week. James Turner will make you some money. And then I'll be off to Columbus, as will Joe, as will many other people. The number of people, students especially, I've talked to who have said some combination of we're going and we don't have tickets yet, we're going to figure it out when we get there, is pretty fascinating. So I'm looking forward to seeing how all this plays out. Joe, it's going to be an amazing time. I can only imagine your anticipation covering this game. I'm excited just to be there.
I will say, like, this is a moment where I'll be down on the field for this one, doing video and stuff like that. I'm going to have to take a second to kind of, like, embrace it and be like, maybe, obviously not cheer, nothing like that, but just watch what's happening. Watch two top 5 teams in one of the best stadiums in the country. And I don't know. I'm getting kind of amped up thinking about it. Like, this is kind of like when I was young. Like, I've always wanted to go to a game like this, and now I'm able to go to a game like this and cover a game like this. So it's fun. I mean, these are two very good teams. Obviously, the $20 million roster versus the young and hungry Hoosiers. I mean, they're not very young, but young and spry for being good at college football.
Man. Well, as always, folks, we love having you here on Bison Chat. We'll be back next week. It'll be a holiday episode. Is your Wi-Fi at home better than your Wi-Fi in your apartment?
It's much better. Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Maybe
I'm not gonna get into it.
Maybe Mom and Dad Cronin can hop on the show for a little bit then as well. But anyway,
wow.
I don't know. Thank you. Emily Fox dipped a little early, but she cut everything up and made all the magic happen. So thank you to Emily. Joe, thank you. Thanks to all you folks for hopping on, whether you're watching us live or whether you're tuning in on the podcast frequencies that we have, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, what have you, or on the YouTube channel. We will be back next week with more Bison Chat Tuesday night. We'll probably, again, have it around when the actual CFP reveal is, and we'll have lots to talk about one way or the other as we also recap what happened in Indiana, Ohio State, and get you ready for the big game that comes up at the end of that week. We'll talk about that then. For Joe Cronin, for Emily Fox, and for the entire Back Home Network, I'm Galen Clavio saying thank you for joining us here on Bison Chat. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.